There's one channel, I don't know if, I guess it's not mine, but
Hola,
we will mute eventually, maybe we don't speak.
Me too, maybe, yes, until I...
I did. Luis, could you, for 1 second, try to mute your microphone? Yeah. Okay, just so you know, when you don't mute it, it's making noise all the time.
Luis, parece que tu micrófono hace ruido extra cuando lo tenés prendido, solo para que sepas.
sí, lo voy a pagar por eso. Lo que pasa es que ahora voy a presentarlo ya. Así que hago eso y lo pago.
Excelente.
Hola, ¿qué tal a todos? Bueno, es un placer presentar a Simon Steen Andersen, compositor danés, y Alejandro Sarriegui, que va a ser el anfitrión y quien va a coordinar todo este encuentro, va a traducir. Simón va a hablar en inglés. Así que bueno, los dejo aquí en este mediodía de invierno en la Argentina y verano en Alemania. ¿Es así? Así que bueno. Alejandro.
Bueno, buenos días y buenas tardes a todos. Como ya dijo Luis, es un placer tener hoy como invitado a Simon Steen Andersen. Voy a presentarlo brevemente con su biografía y después voy a contarles de qué se trata la entrevista y vamos a empezar a hacerle preguntas y pedirle que nos muestre parte de su trabajo más reciente. Simon Steen Andersen nació en el año 1976, es un compositor, performer y realizador de instalaciones danés, radicado en Berlín, y trabaja en el campo entre la música instrumental, la electrónica, el video y la performance, en ámbitos que van desde la orquesta sinfónica y la música de cámara, con y sin multimedia, hasta puestas en escena, actuaciones en solitario e instalaciones. Las obras de la última década se centran en la integración de elementos concretos en la música y en enfatizar los aspectos físicos y coreográficos de la interpretación instrumental. Sus obras suelen incluir instrumentos acústicos amplificados en combinación con samplers, videos, simples objetos cotidianos o construcciones caseras. Ha recibido numerosos premios y becas en los últimos años, los cuales los más relevantes han sido el premio de la Orquesta de la Radio del Sudoeste de Alemania, SWR Orchestra Prize, en el 2019 con su obra Trío, el premio de música Mauricio Kagel y el premio de composición Siemens en el año 2017, el premio de música del Consejo Nórdico y el premio de la Orquesta SWR en el 2014, el premio Carl Nielsen en Dinamarca y el Kunstpreis de la Akademie der Künste de Berlín en el año 2013. La Tribuna Internacional de Compositores, la residencia del DAAD Berlin Kunstlerprogramm en el 2010 y el premio de música Kreinsteiner en el 2008. También es miembro de la Academia Alemana de las Artes desde el año 2016. Simon Steen Andersen estudió composición con Karl Age Rasmussen, Matthias Spalinger, Gabriel Valverde y Bent Sorensen, respectivamente en las ciudades de Aarhus, Friburgo, Buenos Aires y Copenhague entre los años 1998 y 2006. Desde el 2008, Simon Steen Andersen es profesor de composición en la Real Academia de Música de Aarhus, en Dinamarca. Entre el 2013 y 2014 fue profesor visitante de la Academia Noruega de Música de Oslo y en 2014 y 2016 fue profesor de los cursos de vacaciones de verano de Darmstadt, en Alemania. En el 2017 fue profesor invitado de la Universidad de las Artes de Berlín y desde el 2018 enseña en la Universidad de las Artes de Berna, en Suiza. Bueno, esa es la presentación de Simon. Más allá de una pequeña introducción sobre la entrevista, es que vamos a centrarnos hoy en la exposición de los trabajos más recientes y relevantes que Simon ha realizado en los últimos 4 años. Las piezas en las que vamos a indagar son Transit, que es una pieza que está en proceso, que ha comenzado este año. Es un concierto escénico para tuba, ensamble, video en vivo y trabajo en conjunto colaborativo con el ensamble Musikfabrik de Colonia, en Alemania. La segunda obra va a ser Loop of the Nibelung, que es una obra del año 2020, una instalación presentada en forma de video arte realizada en el Festspielhaus de Bayreuth, Alemania. Walk the Walk es otra obra que fue realizada en el año 2020. Es una pieza de teatro musical en colaboración con el ensamble de percusión suizo This and That. Y Trío, que es una obra del año 2019 para orquesta, coro, big band de jazz y videos, estrenada en los Donaueschinger Musiktage, Festival de Música de Donaueschingen también en Alemania. Y también fue interpretada y estrenada por el ensamble vocal, la Big Band y la Radio del Suroeste de Alemania. Y la última obra es Asthma, una obra del 2017, que es una pieza para acordeón y video. Todas las obras están relacionadas con los temas que hemos encontrado en común de interés, como cambios de perspectiva en elementos familiares, integración de sonido y visión, en lugar de solamente superponer, integración de música y escenario, en lugar de poner simplemente uno sobre el otro, y prácticas post-instrumentales e interdisciplinarias. Solo para que sepan, la entrevista está constantemente abierta a preguntas por parte del público. Esta es incluso la parte más interesante, que aprovechen para hacer todas las preguntas que sean necesarias a Simon. Esto lo pueden hacer por el chat y yo las puedo traducir y voy a ir encontrando el momento de ir haciéndole las preguntas, o si se sienten cómodos con el idioma en inglés, pueden preguntarle a él directamente. Así que bueno, voy a darle la bienvenida a Simon y voy a empezar a hacerle algunas preguntas. Hi Simon, how are you doing?
Great. Thank you for inviting me for this meeting. I am actually sitting right now in Venice, Italy, where I'm doing some scouting for a new project. And so I can look at my watch and it tells me I walked 15 kilometers already today. So okay. It's a great break to sit down and talk to you guys. And nice. Yeah, the way I remember it, I used to speak Spanish. We can ask Aide, but that's how I remember it. My Spanish was pretty good. I am very sorry that I don't remember anything. Still, I would say maybe I could understand your questions in Spanish, but I have to reply in English. So I hope that's okay. And of course we have Alejandro to translate when needed.
Yes, I will help with the communication. Bueno, Simon en este momento está en Venecia trabajando y organizándose para un nuevo proyecto. Quizás esa pueda ser también una pregunta que nos podría contar un poco qué está haciendo. Bueno, está muy contento de estar con nosotros y para él es un buen momento de distensión poder compartir con nosotros sus ideas y sus proyectos. La primera pregunta que le voy a hacer a Simon, I will explain first in English the question, or maybe I make you the question in English so you can think a little bit and then I translate.
Or you try in Spanish and we see, maybe I understand.
Okay, cool. La primera pregunta es una pregunta como para romper un poco el hielo y conocernos un poco más también. Simon tiene algo muy particular en su biografía, es algo que a mí también me llamó mucho la atención, y es que él estudió durante un año en Argentina con Gabriel Valverde. Y la pregunta concreta es, ¿qué fue lo que lo motivó y cuál fue su inspiración para estudiar en Argentina? ¿Cómo fue su experiencia? ¿Y qué fue lo más rico o lo más trascendental que aprendió en ese año?
Comprendí.
Excelente.
In 2000, already after studying a few years in Denmark, I realized that I needed to escape. And I was kind of fed up with a certain attitude in Denmark, which was very, very plain and non-critical. And by plain, I mean, it seemed that nothing was right, nothing was wrong, nothing was great, nothing was horrible. Everything was pretty fine. No? And so I thought, that's okay, but I will escape Denmark and see if I can find the opposite. I'm not sure that the truth is in the opposite, but if I have 2 points, I can find my own truth in between. And so I went to Friburgo in Germany with Matthias Sparlinger, and for me that was the perfect opposite. No? And I don't find myself here or there, but having these two opposites was great for me to navigate. And when I had been there for 1 year, I thought, okay, actually I need a third opposite. So something which is opposite to both German and Sparlinger and the Danish mentality that I was so used to. And I somehow knew I had to leave Europe to find this point. And after a little bit of research, my focus narrowed down to Buenos Aires. And I think it started by being South America, looking for a place where there seems to be an amount of culture, but also where it was affordable for me. I had a small scholarship. I'd rather learn Spanish than Portuguese, etc. And then it came down to Buenos Aires. And then the next step was to examine the music. And I got hold of all the music I could find from porteño composers. And I listened to it all. And what spoke to me most was the music of Gabriel Valverde. And it both spoke to me and it also provoked me in a very positive way, especially the use of silences. I am still today kind of a restless composer and listener. No? So I thought, this is perfect. I really love it. And at the same time, it also provokes me a little bit. This could be some very interesting conversations, and it could be a very interesting opposite point to what I know from Germany and Denmark. And so that's what brought me to Buenos Aires, to SEAMC, to Gabriel Valverde. And I must say, my year in Buenos Aires, I loved it. It's amazing. I can't say I have an objective view because, of course, coming from the outside in 2003, I had it very easy and everybody else had it pretty hard. But for me, at least, it gave me a very nice, luxurious or friendly, easy perspective. And I loved the energy. I loved the culture. I loved learning the language. I loved the food, etc. And I was actually very sorry to leave, but I felt I had to go back to Europe to continue where I started. No? When I came back to Europe, I actually thought, I may look for a city that reminds a little bit of Buenos Aires. So I moved to Rome, and I have to admit, I got very disappointed. It was nothing like it. And so what's the best point I remember? I think the energy. Like every day when I walked into the street, I lived very central. It was I was hit by visceral energy, and just this. The only other city I know this is New York, where you kind of just from walking in the streets, you get adrenaline and you get this rush. Of course, it's not everywhere in Buenos Aires, but this is what I loved, and one of the things that I really remember. This it hits you when you enter the street.
Nice. I will translate a bit in the general ideas. Lo más fuerte para él en su descripción es que en su experiencia en Buenos Aires fue la energía con la que él sintió haber vivido este tiempo, es decir, empaparse de la energía porteña, por decirlo de alguna manera, y básicamente fue a estudiar a Argentina porque sintió la necesidad, después de haber estado estudiando en Dinamarca primero, como que todo era muy plano, no había grandes emociones, más o menos dicho en criollo, no pasaba nada. Entonces decidió irse a estudiar a otro lugar y fue a Freiburg, y estando en Freiburg tuvo como esa primera búsqueda de algo opuesto a la comodidad en la que él estaba o en su situación de confort, por así decir. Fue un buen paso, pero todavía sentía que debía hacer mucho más y que tenía que dejar Europa. Uno de los puntos más importantes era cómo poder ver o cómo poder conceptualizar la música europea desde afuera de Europa. Por eso, bueno, empezó a explorar y a investigar sobre lugares que podrían ser interesantes. Tuvo en cuenta cosas como la riqueza cultural, el intercambio que puede haber en diversidad y diferentes cosas. Y en esto llegó él a Buenos Aires, escribió a un par de compositores, y uno de ellos fue Gabriel Valverde, y bueno, fueron muy positivos. De alguna manera, él sintió que lo han provocado de una manera positiva para empujarlo a esta nueva búsqueda, de alguna manera. Ahora lo que le voy a preguntar es básicamente, también en base a esto que ha descrito, es cuáles fueron precisamente esas provocaciones que él consideró positivas y que lo ayudaron a su desarrollo. Algo él mencionó, que su música fue criticada por el uso o el no uso de los silencios. It was like this. The question is your mic is off, I think.
Sorry. Was it a new question? Should I elaborate on the silence?
Yeah, I would like to. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
You were talking about provocations.
Exactly. Well, I think it still is, but in the sense that I am kind of a restless listener and composer. If you listen to my music, there's a high degree of action, and so for me, realizing and really trying to confront myself with this slow pacing was let's say the provocative, because I really had to change the way I listened, and and very useful too, the idea of something that I'm doing since, not as a pure silence, but often working with background noise, even with something in the foreground. I think it's directly inspired by some of these works and some of these discussions with Gabriel. And so it's not just a provocation, also really, well, every provocation kind of expands your mind. And so I wouldn't point to a specific thing, but simply say that was one of the points that helped expand my mind and broaden my horizon.
Nice. Bueno, en base a esta pregunta, lo más interesante o el cambio más importante o por así decir, el aporte más importante que él obtuvo luego de su visita de un año en Argentina, esto que habíamos dicho de la provocación, es decir, la crítica a su música fue el poco uso de los silencios. Es decir, bueno, él se identifica como una persona muy intranquila, que necesita mucha acción, muy activa, y esto él lo refleja o lo reflejaba por lo menos en aquella época de sus composiciones, y exactamente eso fue lo que estos compositores remarcaron en él, y de ahí para él empezó a desarrollarse esta idea de empezar a trabajar con los silencios, o más específicamente con todas estas cosas que él trabaja de sonidos de fondo, sonidos de acompañamiento, de estos tracks, siempre con los videos, incorpora eso a la música. Digamos que eso está influenciado por esta experiencia que él tuvo luego de la crítica y el aporte del compositor, su profesor argentino con quien estudió en Buenos Aires. Nice. Okay, I would like to, really interesting. I would like to go further actually with some of your more recent works. And you were sharing me with emails that we were exchanging. You were talking about Transit, a new piece you are working on. And I would like just to ask you if you could tell us what is this about and sharing with us your job. The question is, what's the concept and the content of it, and which kind of compositional approach and techniques, which probably can be really interesting for young composers which are attending in this new piece. So I will translate, you can figure out what you're going to say. Bueno, vamos a estar indagando en sus trabajos más recientes y más relevantes para él. Él me ha contado en los emails que hemos compartido los últimos días sobre una obra que se llama Transit, y básicamente me gustaría, lo que le pregunté, es si podía compartir con nosotros cuál es el concepto de la obra, cuál es el contenido, qué tipo de técnicas compositivas utiliza y demás. Un paneo general sobre esta pieza.
Great. Yeah, Transit is supposed to be premiered in October, end of October, and it's actually initiated by receiving the Kagel Prize, because the Kagel Prize is part prize money, part money for a project, and so this is the project that will be realized with that part of the project part of the prize, and it's a very simple concept, and it's kind of funny. So let me just introduce it in the right way. So when I'm going to speak about Walk the Walk, my most recent piece, which is a theatrical piece, you could say that one of my aims was to integrate the stage and the music. And often I employ techniques which are very basic in the sense that I try to literally integrate, nothing metaphorically, nothing philosophical, literally integrate. In this case, in Walk the Walk, I use eventually the stage as an instrument. So once the stage is an instrument, there is a complete integration of stage and music, obviously. It's very simple. Now, in Transit, I want to do the opposite, which
May I
is...
explain this concept of integration? Just for the people. Es muy interesante. Bueno, la obra Transit es una obra que se va a estrenar en octubre de este año, a finales de octubre. Es una obra que fue un encargo, bueno, salió básicamente del premio Kagel que él ganó, donde es dinero que es empleado para un trabajo. En este caso, él está trabajando en esta obra Transit. Y hay una cosa, él maneja en esta pieza un concepto, en realidad el concepto contrario, pero en su pieza Walk and Walk, que es otra de las obras que vamos a estar conversando, él habla de un concepto de integración, en este caso escenario y música, y lo que él trata de proponer es un concepto más bien literal, es decir, donde el escenario pasa a ser el instrumento. Y en esta obra Transit, de alguna manera, lo que él quiere hacer es exactamente lo contrario. Y ahora nos va a explicar cómo y por qué.
Exactly. Well, so what's the opposite of using the stage as an instrument? It's obviously using the instrument as a stage.
All right.
And so it's the piece is a sort of tuba concerto, but the form of the piece is that we do an endoscopy of the instrument. So I have an endoscopic camera, and I can go through the tuba. And of course, and then in this way, it's not going to be staged as in theater, but we're going to see the live image on a screen. So it's going to be, let's say, a live cinematic experience. And inside the tuba, there are a lot of people controlling from the outside with magnets, light and objects, and little props, and you have all kinds of things that you would normally have for staging, but everything takes place inside the tuba and is controlled from the outside. And of course, once you're inside the tuba, it's also a little bit a transition to a world which is surreal. And of course, at that point, anything can happen. And in fact, we also come out of the tuba halfway again and into other miniature stage sets. So I have little, let's call them dollhouse stage sets where we also come in. So in fact, it's the sort of movie, sort of surrealistic science fiction movie where the tuba is both the stage, but obviously it's also part of the film score for this film. And it's also, through its vibrations, giving life to some of the aliens that we encounter inside the instrument. Good luck translating.
Yeah, thank you. Básicamente, de la forma que él concibe el opuesto de este concepto de integración es, ok, ahora no es el escenario el que va a ser el instrumento, sino que el instrumento va a ser el escenario. La técnica en la que él desarrolla esta obra y la forma de la obra es con una cámara endoscópica, para hacer endoscopías dentro del cuerpo. Básicamente él la sitúa dentro de la tuba, eso es proyectado en una pantalla gigante, y esto queda como primer plano de la obra, y por eso es, entonces, todas las acciones que van a ir sucediendo dentro de la tuba son, entonces, en este caso, las acciones que van a estar, la tuba es el escenario y las acciones son lo que va pasando. Básicamente con diferentes objetos, algunos objetos magnéticos, con luces y mismo con las ondas que produce la tuba, son los elementos que van desarrollando la pieza, básicamente.
Yeah, so you will have the tuba player, and then you'll have two people doing the camera, and then you'll have three people doing three people doing the, let's say, the scenography and the choreography, really very detailed with magnets on the outside. And the reason you need two for the camera is that the camera has a joystick, so it can kind of look to all sides. So I can really do quite precise, musically timed camera choreography as well. And then the rest of the ensemble are sitting on the sides and are also a part of the score.
Lo que es muy interesante en el desarrollo de esta obra, bueno, hay dos personas manejando las cámaras, creo que una persona tocando la tuba, tres personas trabajando en lo cinematográfico. Lo más importante es que las dos personas que manejan la cámara tienen un joystick, como de consolas de videojuego, y con eso pueden controlar exactamente los movimientos de la cámara dentro de la tuba. Y eso es lo que permite poder obrar muy precisamente y poder, digamos, establecer acciones muy precisas con la música y también trabajar, digamos, muy musicalmente en este contexto.
Do you see the image?
Yes.
So this is obviously just an experiment, not from the actual, but just to show you how I can really compose like a cinematic situation. I have my little object, which looks like an alien, which is like a plastic plant back there, a red light from the back, making it kind of mysterious or dangerous. And then my light in the front, carefully placed. The ball doesn't play a role. I'm just trying out the light. And if you see it, there's a little bit of viscosity in the air and the light. That is a little bit of vaping. So a little bit of smoke blown into it. And these are all just experiments, just to have some photos to kind of sell the piece. But let me see if I can find something. There's also some nice, at one point we get out of the tuba, and it's kind of a spaceship of sorts. I don't have any images, unfortunately, from these other stage sets that I'm working with, but basically you can imagine a little dollhouse situation, a living room. I bought all kinds of little dollhouse plates and cups, and so we have this beautiful room, which is also kind of appearing as a reference to some biographical information that we're going to get from the tuba player, explaining how he started playing the tuba when he was 4 years old. So in a way, it's also the kid's fantasy about this big, fascinating instrument. But then finally we get into this familiar space of the living room, and that space is on top of a subwoofer. So eventually when he starts playing slowly more and more in the tuba, all these things just start flying around. So very, very concrete relationship between sound and stage.
Bueno, la obra lidia, digamos, con estos temas de sonido y escenario. Un poco la forma es, en principio, bueno, hay varios elementos que se pueden apreciar. Las luces también tienen un juego con vapor que soplan dentro de la tuba, que genera también un efecto visual. Un poco la obra, en su punto de clímax, es como formar un poco la idea de un living room o de un espacio común donde uno vive, pero donde todo está pasando dentro de este instrumento, y empieza un poco también como una cosa media infantil con esto de la fantasía de qué hay dentro de este instrumento y qué es lo que pasa, y eso se va desarrollando. Tiene un poco que ver con la forma, creo que algo mencionó del intérprete que empezó a tocar de niño, y las fantasías y las curiosidades que tiene a partir de este instrumento, que en principio es un poco extraño cuando uno no tiene mucho contacto con la música o así, y eso es básicamente cómo se va desarrollando la pieza hasta llegar hasta este punto de madurez, donde lo que se encuentra es esto del living room, esto del espacio común de vida o de hábitat humano, donde uno hace su vida cotidiana, por así decir.
Yeah. So going into the tuba is part science fiction movie, a kid's fantasy, part psychoanalysis, part going into the history of the instrument. So you're kind of traveling into this. And yeah, I would say there are several parts which are climactic, but one of my favorite parts visually is actually passing the valves. Looks really amazing, and of course seeing the lips from the inside when playing.
Sus efectos favoritos son el de los labios tocando directamente en la tuba de una forma convencional, y sobre todo el efecto visual.
But seen from the inside, ¿no? From inside
eso,
the instrument.
visto desde adentro, pero tocado desde afuera, ¿verdad?
Well,
Played from outside.
Played normally, but seen. Good.
Tocado normalmente, pero visto desde la perspectiva interior con la cámara. Y el otro efecto muy interesante que le encuentra, que es también uno de sus favoritos, es cuando la cámara pasa mientras uno baja los pistones de la tuba.
Okay.
Do you have some? You don't have any ownership of these effects, no? That you can show.
Nothing great. Nothing great.
Right.
It's
Fine.
gonna you're gonna have to wait. Yeah. But in a way, to sum it up and maybe make a bridge to walk the walk, I think one of the things that fascinates me here is to, in a way, work with a very familiar form and actually aim at familiar situations, so familiar that they're almost cliches. In this case, they're cinematic cliches, but to do it in the wrong place with the wrong material, so to speak. So in a way, for me, when you have something cliche from a big movie and suddenly you're applying it to a situation where you're inside a tuba, that changes the perspective completely, and this cliche becomes something else and actually can help twist the whole thing in this weird situation where it's both the cinematic situation and obviously it's just a weird journey into this big brass instrument.
Uh-huh. Lo más fascinante para él es el hecho de trabajar con situaciones tan cotidianas que llegan a ser cliché, digamos, que son muy normales, que uno conoce mucho, que casi que lo hace, digamos, sin pensar, pero generar estas situaciones con elementos completamente no familiares y en situaciones y contextos no familiares, como es el caso de querer generar este ambiente tan familiar, pero dentro de una tuba y con objetos que no pertenecen a la tuba. Y esta es una forma para él de transformación de estas situaciones tan familiares.
Right. And in a way, it's almost, and let's move to Walk the Walk, where you could say there's a similar situation, because in Walk the Walk is in a funny way very much a piece of multimedia performance, except there is really no multimedia, at least not in the normal sense where you expect there to be video. And so again, it's a sort of transformation where I'm trying to recreate everything we know and that is native for video and film editing and even aesthetics. And I'm trying to apply that without cameras, without projectors. So everything that goes on is physical and mechanical. But again, looking for the cliches, and so it is very familiar, but at the same time you realize the media has changed. So now it really means something else.
En la siguiente obra de la que va a hablar, que es Walk to Walk, hay un fenómeno que es parecido al de la obra Transit y tiene que ver otra vez con este fenómeno de la transformación. Walk to Walk sería en realidad una performance multimedia, pero a su vez no lo es, porque todas las acciones que van sucediendo son acciones recreadas físicamente. Is this what you want to say?
Pretty much. And of course, there are many other things going on, but in this sense, also there's a big connection between Walk the Walk and Transit. Just like there is this idea of literally integrating the stage and the music. And maybe I should show a little example of a technique that really is very used and kind of native for cinema. And maybe it makes sense on a theater stage too, but really I never saw it. And so it's a so-called whip pan. It's when you focus on a subject and then you make a quick pan to another subject. And usually in films, it will have a little sound. So it'll go, yeah. And it's sometimes used for, often used for more comedic effects, but it can be really used also in action when you kind of go from one side to the other. So very much used by Edgar Wright, Wes Anderson, etc. They love this. And so what does this look like on a theater stage? Because obviously I can't have one focus and then my subject move away and have another subject come in. But I can have a handheld spotlight. So it's almost as if I'm redoing the movement of the camera. So I have my spotlight and I have my choreographed light movement to the next subject and back to the first subject, etc. And I would like to show you a little example of this. We'll see if it works with the shared screen.
I would like to explain this technique because it's really interesting to understand what you're saying. Él está hablando de, otra vez, esto de la integración literal, música y escenario en este caso. Él está hablando de una técnica cinematográfica, que dijo el nombre en inglés, pero no me acuerdo, pero que es esto de whip. Tener una imagen.
Yeah. Whip is actually like a whip.
Ah, yeah, like a látigo.
Yeah. And pan is the panorama. So it's like...
Esta idea de panorama de látigo, es esto de cuando una cámara está fija en un objeto y rápidamente se mueve hacia otro objeto y mantiene el foco en el mismo, pero tiene que ver, dice que en el cine esta técnica normalmente está siempre acompañada de un sonido y que el desafío de él era adaptar esta técnica al teatro. Y para hacer esto, él lo solucionó con luces y coreografías de movimientos. Y ahora nos va a mostrar ejemplos para que lo podamos.
Okay. And as you all know, when you share the screen on Zoom, we will have a lower frame rate, but I think it's the fastest instead of sending you all links. So let's try it and let me know if you get the sense of it. No? Let me first find. Yes. So let me try this. Share sound. Here it is. I don't know why. This used to be a real full screen. Anyway, I'll do it like this. There.
Someone is asking if this video is with no sound, right?
No, this is with sound. Okay, it doesn't work.
I think the sound is not working.
There's absolutely sound. So if you didn't hear sound, it didn't work.
Ah, okay, then it didn't work.
Okay.
El ejemplo que acaba de mostrar en realidad debería sí ir acompañado de un sonido.
Okay.
En este momento no.
And I mean, I can hear the sound, and I said share the sound. But so I think the only thing I can really do, I don't know why it's not working, is to send you a link. Let me see. This is one of the things where I can actually send you a link. It just takes a little time sometimes, of course. Let me stop sharing. So now, see. Okay. In that case, it's going to be a little difficult with some examples, and so we'll maybe do less examples. But for this, you can have an example here, and somehow let me know when you're done. ¿No?
Nice. Nos acaba de mandar un link para que lo podamos ver con sonido. Es un link de YouTube que está en el chat. Lo pueden ver ahora en este momento. Creo que no es muy largo y cuando terminen pueden avisarnos y continuamos con la entrevista. Some people is replying that they already seen it. Your mic is off.
Okay, great. Very simple example. Since I can't give you examples of the other thing I wanted to show you, I will send you the link for the trailer where there's a little bit of the other example of a little bit of an example of another very typical technique that is one of the most simple ones when you edit video, but which really is impossible on a theater stage, which is the idea of a loop. And so I work a lot with loops. And the way I do it is, let me just find this. The way I do it is I have 4 characters and they're dressed the same way. And I have the stage is sort of set up on almost as a 2-dimensional situation where you have like a cinema with curtains, and you have this place where they can walk from left to right and right to left, but you still have this feeling that is almost 2-dimensional, as if it's really the screen. And then basically you'll see some of it in this clip. You have one person passing, and when he leaves, the next person comes in. So you almost have a loop, and then you can kind of trim this loop by making the curtain smaller, smaller, smaller. So I wanted to show you this particular place where it's just looping and getting smaller and longer, etc. But I'll send you the link for the trailer, and you'll see some of that, because the other one I don't have as a link. So here's one more example, the trailer for the whole show.
Esto es para ver una técnica de loop, pero en el contexto del teatro. People is replying.
Great. So, well, it's a big show. There's so much to tell. It's 1.5 hours, but I think really that's one of them. Yeah. No. That's really one of the main points you come across here in a way. Alejandro mentioned some of these elements or ideas that kind of seem to be common in all my recent projects, which is this obviously working with the found material. As you hear, there's a lot of music and sounds that come from popular culture or that I've simply used, that I've simply found, all kinds of everyday objects. In a way, I also see walking, which is kind of the main physical theme of the piece, as a found object. At least it's kind of an everyday action that doesn't really have any big expressivity, but has this wonderful non-formal, non-serious feel to it, like sometimes if you have an everyday object. The integration of sound and vision, very much, you can't really separate those two. The stage and music as well. Physicality and choreography is, I think, is very obvious. It's the stage is one big mechanical machine, and it has things you can pull, and you have this track where you can have objects move in the back and on the track above. So there are all these different things you can do, and of course it's very physical because you have these treadmills so that people can run in the same place. And basically, after 1.5 hours, these performers, they're dead, right? Because it's really a tour de force. And there's actually a fifth performer as well, working all the time backstage. And none of these 5 performers ever have a break. They're like constantly for 1.5 hours doing their show, really physical. And then the last thing, which is also kind of a common idea in all of these pieces, is a certain amount of self-reference. So that, of course, in a way, there is a story. Actually, not really, and of course, I have 4 performers, so you could say this is a piece for something, but much more, it's a piece about. It's not a piece for a cinematic mechanical setting. It's a piece about cinematic techniques. It's a piece about all these cliches and this aesthetics. And it becomes so by making this medial translation, because these are all phenomena that we normally don't think about because they're just a part of the experience. But now actually, because we transform them, we look at them in a different way. We realize them as twisted. So there's this element of estrangement that makes everything what it is, but also not quite. So nothing is what it seems. So it has these 2 different layers.
Supongo, la idea con la que trabaja él, o las ideas que tienen en común estas piezas son, las últimas 2 piezas en las que hablamos, son otra vez el tema de la integración, en este caso entre sonido y visuales. No son piezas que traten de relatar algo, sino que son piezas que son sobre algo. Es decir, el tema en especial son las técnicas cinematográficas, pero transformadas, en este caso, por ejemplo, llevadas al contexto del teatro. Es decir, sigue habiendo una correlación en esto de la transformación y de los clichés y de sacar las cosas de su contexto natural o cómodo o casi inconsciente, como lo conocemos, para llevarlo a otro campo. En este caso es otra vez del cine, las técnicas del cine llevadas al teatro. También, bueno, en esta obra en particular, él trabaja mucho con la fisicalidad y la coreografía, que es también parte de la parte que lidia con lo corporal. Así como dato de color, nos contó que la obra dura como 1 hora y media y que los performances realmente después es una exigencia muy grande, no tienen ninguna pausa, corren de atrás adelante del escenario y digamos, tiene mucho trabajo físico y corporal y de presencia también por los elementos teatrales. y el escenario también está, digamos, es un escenario preparado, es decir, el escenario en sí mismo pasa a ser, en este caso también, un instrumento, es como una máquina con un montón de sistemas mecánicos que cuelgan y que ellos van utilizando, transformando y desarrollando a través de ellos la obra.
Cool. So you could
Yeah.
say by taking film and video native elements and techniques into a live theatrical performance, in a way, automatically it becomes about these techniques. They're not just the medium, they also become the subject, but actually it also becomes about theater, because you're of course meeting in a way the limitations. You're fighting against impossibilities because of course you cannot make a loop, and so in a way it becomes very much about both, and in this sense it's self-referential, and it becomes a reflection on the media which is being used.
Es decir, justamente el tema principal de la pieza entonces es justamente esta transformación, es decir, estas técnicas que, por ejemplo, en el cine son el medio para transmitir o comunicar una idea, en este caso el contenido esencial de la obra son estas técnicas porque hay que sacarlas del concepto cinematográfico y uno se encuentra con los problemas y las limitaciones o las otras características que tiene el teatro, y el querer implementar estas técnicas y, digamos, arreglarlas y buscar las soluciones para que en el ámbito teatral puedan funcionar, se transforma, digamos, en el tema principal de la obra. Es decir, la obra es sobre las técnicas cinematográficas, pero en un contexto ajeno.
And so there are so much more to say about this piece. Probably, I mean, I can't really, it's a difficult piece. I can never really stop. So maybe it's a good place to stop actually here and say this is at least on the surface the most important perspective. And maybe we look, maybe I say one thing, which is the technical aspect of this piece, which is that obviously they don't have scores because they're on stage all the time, and everything is very precise, and that is obtained by having 4 individual click tracks. And instead of the score, there are verbal instructions. So basically a voice tells them where to go, what to do next, gives them a countdown, gives them a click track, and gives them commands throughout this 1.5 hour.
So you're talking to them live, so to say.
No, it's pre-recorded because it's 4 at the same time. No, it's impossible. So
yeah, right.
And then so everything is actually, you could say the score is the sequencing of all this, and of course on top of this you have the playbacks, and you have the also the light programming. I don't know if we saw so much now, but every light is programmed on sound as well. So we have 1.5 hour of just quite complex light programming as well.
Nice. I have someone is wanted to ask something. Maybe I will tell about a technical aspect, and then I can ask her if she wants to talk or if I have to translate something. Lo que acaba de decir es un aspecto técnico de la pieza que también denota un poco de la dificultad de la misma, que es que, bueno, los músicos no tocan con partituras, es decir, todo lo que se desarrolla tiene que ser aprendido de memoria, pero también con el objetivo de estar o de mantener la concentración o de llegar al objetivo de que la obra se desarrolle de la manera correcta, trabajan con un click track. Es decir, en la oreja tienen un metrónomo y tienen las grabaciones, las luces ya están preprogramadas, e incluso en las grabaciones tienen consignas para acordarse, por ejemplo, cuál es el siguiente paso o qué es lo que hay que hacer y demás. Esto es como la manera de poder buscar la solución a no depender de la partitura para poder trabajar en todos los aspectos escénicos. Carolina creo que quiere preguntar algo. Creo que es un buen momento para hacer preguntas. habiendo,
Absolutely.
digamos, resumido un poco estas dos piezas y visto el paralelismo, quizás si tienen preguntas sería buenísimo, este sería el momento para que lo puedan hacer. Carolina, no sé si querés hablar o querés
I can
escribir.
speak a little bit English if you don't understand. You can. I want to ask about the expertise of the performance. They are actors, or you have to decide in some moment of the process if they're going to be actors or percussionists or musicians.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. In this case, they're percussion players, and I think I tried something similar with actors, and I think there's quickly a limit to how complex and precise they can be. On the other hand, there are some quite demanding moments where, in fact, these performers have to act, and that is actually often quite dangerous. And so the technique I use for this is that I try to make them not act, but I try to often to make them either be themselves. So, for example, there is a very typical cliche situation that keeps coming back, which is a sort of interview, like when you go on YouTube and you watch a press tour for a film, you can see the actors in front of the movie poster speaking about the movie, and yeah, the director was great, etc. And this kind of situation I try to recreate, and I work with them in being kind of themselves. Of course, I script it, but at least it's more easy to be yourself than to take on some role. The other extreme is sometimes they do something which is more like a caricature. They do some kind of exaggeration or reenactment, but that is really the difficult part. But I really do believe that it has to be musicians. Now, the funny story about this is that at some point they started getting a little bit worried and slightly annoyed because they really didn't feel that their expertise as musicians were used, right? And so finally, I convinced them that they were in fact necessary, and I think also now they really see it. Nobody else could do this. It's simply not possible. But at the same time, the skepsis came into the narrative. I took this and I made a little script out of it, so that in these press tours, they're actually complaining a little bit, and they're telling the story about one of the players asking me if I was even sure if it had to be musicians who played this piece. And so they even reflect on this in the piece. And in the piece, then they say that I kind of shut him up by saying, fine, I'll give you a big drum solo in the end. No? And in the end, he gets this big drum solo. And so again, this is another level of self-reflection, which is really almost documentary, but of course dramatized a little bit. But I did this with actors as well, and I found it much less precise. Of course, they're much better at learning text, but in fact, in one of the cases, I still couldn't, acting-wise, get what I wanted, because there was still a certain style of acting. So, yeah. But normally my technique is to find a way to use musicians, but never to tell them to act, but always tell them what to do. And so if I want something theatrical, I let it happen from what they do. But the moment they think they're doing something, they're still musicians. They're, okay, you're going over there, you're doing this, you're doing that, etc. The moment you say, now you have this role and you move over there and you do, then it doesn't work because they become very self-aware and very stiff, and it's bound to fail.
Thank you. And I can ask another question, or do you want to translate, Alejandro, first?
It's too long to translate, right?
Okay.
No. Yes, but there's a couple of ideas which are really interesting, actually.
Okay.
I would like to tell them because I think it's important.
Sure,
La pregunta de Carolina fue si él esta obra, si él la concibió para hacer con actores o con músicos, o con qué tipo de artistas es mejor hacerla. Él está definitivamente convencido de que hacerlo con músicos es mejor. Si bien los actores tienen mucha más facilidad para aprender textos y demás, para él el hecho de que estén actuando hace que pierda un poco de naturalidad. Entonces, su estrategia es agarrar músicos, que los músicos tienen la calidad de ser mucho más precisos en la performance, es decir, en las cosas, por ejemplo, que van juntas con las acciones, que van juntas con las luces o con diferentes tipos de otras acciones externas. Él encuentra que con músicos se puede hacer muchísimo mejor. Y lo que él hace para que los músicos de alguna manera, digamos, actúen, es simplemente explicarles, darles consignas sobre qué hacer. Porque si él, digamos, les da un rol de actor, él tiene la sensación de que el músico se siente angustiado, incluso se siente, sale de su zona de confort y nunca va a estar satisfecho, y eso produce, digamos, una frustración. En este caso, lo que él hace es tomar músicos por la cualidad que tienen de la precisión, y la estrategia es no decirles que tienen que actuar, sino que dejarlos ser ellos mismos y darles consignas de qué es lo que tienen que hacer. Eso nada más. Carolina, tu siguiente pregunta, por favor. Sí.
Sí, and there are questions about the process of the configuration of the audiovisual dispositive of the piece. You work in a space, like a site-specific process for the final configuration of everything, or not? Or you planify and you adapt it to everything without problems?
So I would say I can't really generalize because it's very different. It's different from piece to piece. So in this case, it's not site specific because this stage that you saw, we built that. And so we also went on a tour. And so we put it in a container, we shipped the container, we set it up. A lot of work, too much work really. But that's how we did this. That's the only way I can do with this whole mechanic thing. No? And then I have a lot of other pieces where I work site specific in various ways. And I would say even in general, when I have a big show and I have some time, I always try to actually adapt to the space I'm performing in as much as I can. And the best I know is when I do something with an old piece in a new location where people will think, oh, it's like made for this location. No? And so I always look for these things to integrate the space. It's not always possible, but I really like when it's possible. And maybe you were also hinting a little bit about the process. Like, did I do all this at my desk at home? And I did not, because that's not possible. Because there are 3 elements that are interdependent, yes, which is the stage, the composition, and the physicality of the performance. So I have this idea, they walk over here. Now, okay, to do this, to calculate this, I have to know the distance. And then I have to build the stage. And then once the stage is built, I have to try it out with the musicians. But so obviously, so in fact, it was like a process where all 3 was occurring at the same time, because I couldn't finish the composition before the stage was completely built. But I couldn't really build the stage before I tried it out with the musicians, because sometimes they say, no, this is too high. We can't run this fast over this little step. And so it was actually like a paradox of 3 elements. And then it really had to go together. So it had to be at the same time. Very interesting process, very tough process too.
Amazing.
Carolina, perdón. ¿Lo explico un poco, esta última idea? La pregunta de Carolina fue con relación al espacio, es decir, al escenario. Si siempre, digamos, es el mismo escenario y si es algo fijo o no. Simon nos explicó que siempre es diferente, porque siempre cada escenario es diferente y cada situación es diferente, y su estrategia es una estrategia de adaptación. Incluso cuando él tiene que volver a tocar obras que él ha compuesto antes, en un escenario nuevo y demás, siempre, digamos, no lo puede planear desde su casa en el escritorio y decir esto va a ser así o asá. Siempre él necesita, digamos, estar en el lugar concreto y poder trabajar con eso. Y hay 3 elementos que son fundamentales y que son interdependientes entre sí y que son los que determinan que él pueda terminar con la pieza. Estos elementos son el escenario en sí mismo, es decir, el espacio donde se desarrolla la pieza, la composición, es decir, todos los aspectos que él tiene que decidir compositivos para que la obra tome su forma, y la fisicalidad de la performance. Siempre pasa entre un escenario y otro, la forma del escenario es diferente, o el escalón que el performer tiene que subir o bajar es distinto, y todas estas cosas son cosas que él tiene que probar en el lugar, y sin esos elementos, él digamos, no puede concluir una pieza, o no puede, digamos, volver a recrear una obra. Es decir, el espacio siempre es algo dinámico, siempre está en constante cambio, y la estrategia es de adaptación.
So for the sake of contrasts, because I don't think we have time for all the examples. I mean, I can go on, but maybe for the sake of contrast, I talk a little bit about trio, because yeah. And afterwards, if you want to see something very location specific, and if you have not seen it, I will send you the link to the Loop of the Nibelung, which is my newest spin-off of my project, long time going, which I also showed examples of in La Plata when I was there a few years ago. Runtime Era. So Runtime Era becomes the Loop of the Nibelung in this weird Wagnerian version. I'll send you a link for this. You can watch it yourself if you haven't seen it, or and if you would like to. But if I go to trio, in a way, we're still dealing with found material. In trio, it's the same as in Walk the Walk. I basically didn't compose in the traditional sense because I didn't really come up with material. It's just combining materials. And again, it's a sort of self-reflection in the sense that is not a piece, of course, it's a piece for orchestra, etc. But actually it's much more a piece about orchestra, about the ensembles. And again, my starting point is looking for ways to change perspective in the way we listen to something familiar. So if you start there, Alejandro, then I think this is a good place to translate.
Yeah, absolutely. La siguiente obra, bueno, primero también nos dijo, no vamos a llegar por una cuestión de tiempo a indagar en todas sus obras. Su obra, incluso Loop of the Nibelung, nos va a dejar un link para que después cada uno lo pueda ver. Es una obra muy larga, cada uno lo puede chequear en sus casas. Él quiere ahora empezar con la obra Trío, que es para 3 tipos de formaciones al mismo tiempo: orquesta, coro vocal, ensamble vocal y jazz big band. Esta obra todavía está trabajando también con materiales encontrados y demás, pero el punto principal es la reflexión propia. Es decir, la obra trata de este tipo de ensambles, es decir, trata sobre ensambles y formaciones musicales, y es otra vez, digamos, el concepto principal o la idea principal, el objetivo es repensar las perspectivas, es decir, volver a hacer cambios en las perspectivas de cómo contemplar estos ensambles, y vamos a ver ahora cómo Simon hace el approach hacia esto.
Yeah. And in this case, it's really very simple, but it was the very first idea. It's simply, what can we do with an orchestra to make us listen to it slightly differently? And I would say the main twist here is really to put the big band next to it. And already I would claim we listen to the orchestra differently. It gives it a different context. It's a whole different sound. It's a whole different culture. It's a different style. And the orchestra has this wonderful, or actually our minds transform the orchestra from being the media as we are normally used, to being, well, an orchestra. We can actually now the orchestra is also there as an orchestra, almost as extras in a theater piece. They also now don't just play the role of the sound, they also play the role of the orchestra. The moment that you juxtapose it with this other element. And the next element that does the same in a way is the juxtaposition with archive material. So the moment you have an orchestra playing live, and then right after you have the orchestra playing in black and white in an old recording, maybe from the 60s, obviously you have a similar kind of juxtaposition. And the moment you come back to the live orchestra, you listen differently, because you have put it in the context of, well, in this case, its own history. Mute or unmute.
Sorry, yes. El objetivo entonces es crear diferentes perspectivas, y la primera pregunta que él se hace, o la primera idea que él trata de desarrollar, es cómo poder escuchar a una orquesta de una forma diferente. Entonces, básicamente lo que hace es transformar la función de la orquesta y no contemplarla en sí misma como el elemento que produce sonido, sino que lo que hace es como tener una visión en sí misma, retrospectiva, y contemplarla como el ensamble, como lo que es, no como un instrumento sonoro, sino como un instrumento formado por diferentes secciones y por diferentes cosas, y contemplar al objeto en sí mismo. Para esto lo que hace es una superposición entre performances en vivo en el momento y ciertas grabaciones de los años 60, 70 de directores conocidos en blanco y negro, y este ida y vuelta de escuchar en vivo y escuchar cosas superpuestas del pasado es lo que hace que uno pueda empezar a desarrollar un cambio de perspectiva con el objetivo de escuchar a la orquesta de una manera diferente.
And so you could say that it's also, this setup is also coming, or the way I'm treating this, because as you will see, there are very little situations where the three ensembles, choir, orchestra, and big band, or the three historic ensembles, which is recordings of choir, big band, and orchestra from the past. There's very little situations where these are active at the same time. It's almost always the one, then the other, then the third, etc. So, in fact, it's still one part music, and of course it's not one part because there's also harmonies, but at least it's in a way it's not a polyphonic music. It's really either here or there, and that is on one hand kind of a continuation of my fascination with, let's say, a sort of sample aesthetics, where you're really gluing together very different sound worlds. You could say, in a way, that it's an extreme form of broken instrumentation, or even timbre melody. And if you want to take this further, you could say, obviously, when you have first the orchestra, then the big band, you have a timbre melody, quite extreme, but you actually also have something else. You could also call it a style melody, because it's not just timbre. We also listen to the big band in a whole different way. It has a whole different luggage. It has a whole different feeling. It has a different style. So it's a style melody as well, or a style interval. And when you go from live to historic, we have something that we could almost call a time interval, or time melody, sort of a time interval. So you can kind of, you have a music that can jump not just in sound, but also in style and in time.
La idea es, digamos, los tres ensambles están actuando en vivo y al mismo tiempo se está lucidando o, digamos, citando cosas del pasado. Entonces hay un movimiento en la forma de escuchar, hay una traslación en el tiempo, un intervalo de tiempo, que esto genera para él una cosa que también cambia, digamos, la perspectiva de contemplación y de cómo tomarlo, por justamente el desarrollo de los estilos en el tiempo. ¿Perdón?
No, so it's better if you start and say, so in a way, there are intervals of timbre, as in broken instrumentation, like we know it from classical music. And that is expanded to also be intervals of style and intervals of time.
What is it, the genre? Is it intervals of genre?
Timbre, sound.
What's that? Okay, yeah.
Sonido. It's like in English we call it broken instrumentation. It's the same as when Mozart starts a melody in the flute and then it continues in the clarinet.
Okay.
Broken instrumentation. I don't know what it's called in Spanish.
Yeah. It's broken instrumentation. It's a translation from one sound, the same sound doing from other instrument and going. It always
continues in another. Yeah, exactly.
In that this deals with the time and also with the concept of performing live.
And in the same way, this is then expanded to do the same phenomena which we know classically. Now it's just much more extreme because it's not from flute to clarinet, it's from symphony orchestra to big band. And at that time, it's not just an interval or a jump of timbre. It's also an interval of style.
Yeah. Habla de intervalos. En principio hay intervalos y expansiones, es decir, una expansión de sonido, de melodías y de timbres que van pasando de instrumentos a otros y de un ensamble al otro. Y por el otro lado, esto también pasa en el tiempo, pero también no solamente en el sonido, sino también en el estilo y en la estética, por, digamos, el estilo con el que cada uno de estas formatos musicales se ha desarrollado en la historia estética de la música.
And exactly, and the last level is then the skips in time, the jumps in time. No? So it's a music jumping in style and time and sound.
Okay. Saltos entre estilo, sonido y tiempo. Esa es, digamos, la conclusión.
Yeah. Okay, and again, it's a super long piece. As you see, I'm very fascinated these days. I made a lot of miniatures, but now I'm somewhere else. I'm making huge pieces and large formats, often almost always these days, sort of theatrical. So it's a 50 minutes long piece, and it kind of starts very slowly by showing this idea. So the first thing you hear is you hear C major on an old recording from the orchestra, and then the live orchestra comes in and plays the same C major, and it's slightly out of tune, and it has a little bit of a different sound, obviously. So slowly it expands from this idea very pedagogically, you know. Well, I'm going to skip all that because it's always also online. You can listen to the whole thing if you want. And I'll kind of go to the climax so you can really see this idea of samples from the different styles and times going very fast back and forth in a kind of ping pong game.
Lo que él va a hacer es mostrar los nuevos ejemplos en el clímax de la obra, en esto de ir saltando en el tiempo como una especie de ping pong, entre ida y vuelta en el tiempo, básicamente.
Y el estilo.
Y el estilo.
Yeah, and also just to say this, no, people can see it at home if they want. So let's see, this one is Schmuck. Very super short example.
Ahí está el link para que Should we look at this now? Yeah. Cada uno lo puede ver ahora y luego chateamos cuando.
Okay, so very short to the point example. There's a lot of other things going on, but like this, I can at least, you have an idea of the setup. And the interesting part of this piece was I did not want to play anything live that I couldn't reflect in the archive material, or that I couldn't also play in the archive material. So everything which is used is based on what I could find in this TV archive of South German radio. So basically, the whole process again started with just watching many hundred hours of recordings of concerts and rehearsals, and then chopping it up, organizing it, etc. And then I only used what I could find. No, I might have wanted or had ideas for something else, but I limited myself to use this so that I could always have the same material live as on the video.
Es todo lo que usa, todo el material que él compone para que sea tocado en vivo es material que él ha encontrado en todos estos archivos de radio y televisión que utiliza en la obra. Es decir, podría haberlo hecho de otra manera, pero él decidió que el sentido de esto era todo lo que él haya podido o pueda, digamos, manifestar en un video, en una grabación, en un archivo, que son los que usa en el video compuesto, digamos, que es el que se ve en la obra, en la grabación, es decir, en la performance. Son todos ejemplos, es decir, todas las cosas que se tocan en vivo son ejemplos de cosas que él encontró en los archivos.
Yes, and what was my next step? Don't remember. So I had my next point. Don't remember. Okay, it's gone. Yeah, the only thing that is not from the archives is the first recording ever of an orchestra and a choir, which is a piece by Händel, recorded in 1888, and it's almost gone. You can barely hear it, like voices of ghosts from the past. And at one point, the music stops and goes really into a reenactment of this Händel piece, full on in the live orchestra, and then slowly it's slowed down and transformed into the playback of this old recording. So that's everything else comes from the archive.
hay solo un ejemplo que él no sacó de las grabaciones de radio pública o televisión, que es una grabación de Händel de una obra del año 1888, y es un material, digamos, que siempre va siendo desarrollado por la orquesta y quedando cada vez más atrás en algo de fondo. Es un material que está ahí y es lo único que él no sacó de estos archivos de radio y televisión.
And there is an interesting sort of narrative taking place on top of these combinations of musics and expansions, and that is a sort of anecdotal narrative coming from spoken passages mostly from rehearsals, where you have old recordings of the conductors instructing or explaining what to do, and a prominent figure that kind of becomes a sort of main character in this other narrative is Celibidache, and he has sort of cadenza, if you will, a little past the middle of the piece, where he sort of where his comments are sort of transformed into a song or a lead. And finally, when there is this famous clip where he is live instructing while conducting. So finally, that piece is being played as it is, but the choir is reenacting his comments almost as if it's a vocal part on top of this music. So maybe all I can do is to give you, just to see this other aspect of this piece, to give you a link, and we can listen to this as well, and then afterwards we can talk more. Let me find it real quick and send it to you.
Nos va a mandar un link sobre un ejemplo dentro de la obra donde se desarrolla una narrativa dentro de toda esta combinación y expansión de música, y hay algunos pasajes hablados de los directores, por ejemplo, en ensayos de orquesta y demás. Hay ciertos pasajes sobre un personaje que termina siendo como en algún punto un personaje principal dentro de la obra, que es Celibidache, director de orquesta, y básicamente son grabaciones y pasajes de un ensayo donde él, o de una performance, no lo sé, donde él está, mientras conduce, va dando consignas al coro de la orquesta, y esto es lo que se termina tomando, Simon lo termina tomando como material para construir material musical y una melodía, una canción, algo por el estilo. Ahora lo vamos a ejemplificar en un video que nos va a mandar.
Okay, and so this is not a clip, it's actually just starting at the right time, but so let's say I stop everybody when we get past a certain point. I will watch it with you, but it's 2 or 3 minutes. Here's the link. Is it the same link? Then I did a mistake. Stop. I think it's the same link.
Okay, I could not open yet, but
Yes, it's the same.
okay.
So I'm sorry about that. Here it comes. It is actually a continuation of that other place, but here it comes. if you start it more or less immediately, then the Strauss should be over. So in a way, this is much less theatrical than the other pieces we talked about. But as you see, it has this theatrical extra level as well. And later there's also a sort of documentary level. And everything is discussing itself again. It's reflecting back on itself, on the history. And it's a very loving portrait of the history of these European radiophonic stations, TV and radio, that that has really, after the Second World War, played a huge role in European music life, and very often they were represented by the orchestra and the choir, and then the big band for the entertainment, and the jazz. And so in a way that is slowly dissolving now. And so in a way, this is like a sort of celebration, but it's not serious. And it's also, so it's taking lovingly, it's making lovingly fun of these people. So, but in a nice way. So they're not being ridiculed, I think, but at least we get to see them again, and in a sort of a new perspective. And I think what I think is really works in this piece is that there are really moments where I have the feeling that there is a sort of chamber music acknowledgement between the present and the past musicians. And there are these certain passages where it's really beautiful, this sort of situation where you have live players playing with their dead historic colleagues from the past.
Bueno, en sí mismo es, digamos, la pieza tiene que ver con es el reflejo de sí mismo, de estas formaciones musicales y estos archivos de radio y televisión que, digamos, han influenciado toda la vida musical en Europa, digamos, la orquesta y el coro como resultado, digamos, de la música académica, así decir, y la orquesta y la big band para el jazz y el entretenimiento, es de alguna manera reflejar algo, un poco una crítica, digamos, chistosa de estas tradiciones y de la influencia y el impacto que han tenido en el desarrollo musical en Europa, pero a su vez, digamos, no intenta ser provocador. Es simplemente una reflexión más bien objetiva y termina teniendo este tipo, o termina dándose de una forma humorística.
And so I think this kind of shows, especially if you see a little bit of the loop of the Nibelung too, which is something else entirely in a way, where I'm also performing myself. With those three pieces and projects, I think you see both what is the common denominator in all these ideas, but also how extremely different the results are. ¿No?
Si uno después observa también con la otra obra, Nibelung, Loop of the Nibelung, hay, digamos, un montón de factores comunes, pero cada una de las obras también a su vez se desarrolla en una dirección diferente. Luego nos va a dejar el link para que podamos chequear, curiosamente, digamos, esta obra, que no vamos a tener tiempo para discutirla en vivo, pero es básicamente eso. Hay muchos denominadores comunes, a pesar de que todas las obras son muy diferentes.
Yeah, and 1 second, okay. Yeah, and quite extremely different, I would say. No, really, on certain level, each piece is sort of its own little world. And I say that because I find myself actually composing less and less, and really trying to take more time before I even commit to a project to see if I can come up with something, some kind of concept, some kind of idea that will guarantee that this piece can have a strong identity, something that will make it special and unique. And so I find myself using more and more time pre-compositional and less time actually composing. Or maybe I use the same time composing, but I'm taking much longer preparing, looking for a setup, looking for an idea to once again change the perspective or create a strong identity.
Relacionado con su comentario anterior, donde él nos comentó que todas sus obras, si bien tienen un denominador común, son extremadamente diferentes, pero esto, digamos, es importante entenderlo porque él se encuentra hoy en día, digamos, más bien cada vez, por así decir, componiendo menos y más tiempo precomponiendo. Esto significa que él pasa mucho más tiempo buscando ideas y desarrollando conceptos con el objetivo de que cada obra que él haga tenga una identidad propia y sea auténtica y sea lo suficientemente fuerte y adquiera la envergadura que él precisa. Es decir, hoy en día para él es más importante el concepto o pasa mucho más tiempo, invierte mucho más tiempo buscando eso y que eso realmente se vea en la pieza y en la composición, por así decir, en sí misma.
At the same time, I hope it's clear that when I speak about concepts and a strong concept and a strong idea, that my goal is not to have a strong conceptual music with a less important realization. On the contrary, I really do believe that you can have both a strong concept and a strong realization that you really have to experience physically live to really appreciate it. And so normally we consider these contradictions, concept music, you have a strong idea, but sometimes you don't even really need to experience it. Already from hearing about it, you will know. And so sometimes we consider these opposites that exclude each other, but I really do believe in that they can be combined, that you can both have something strong on the conceptual level and strong in the sensoric level, something that has to be experienced, that has to be felt. And at the same time, you can see I'm working a lot with humor, etc. I also believe that you can combine something which has an immediacy, something where you don't have to be maybe super educated or have a lot of experience in a certain kind of music. On the other hand, I believe that is combinable with something which is still complex, that has many layers, and which is dealing with noise and things that are strange and non-familiar. So there are two different things, ¿no? Yeah.
Explica que en su concepción artística hoy en día hay una dualidad. Él no concibe, digamos, la música conceptual como la conocemos hoy en día, que es una idea muy fuerte, pero con una realización que muchas veces ni siquiera es necesario experimentarla para entender la pieza, sino que él cree que es la realización fuerte y la experiencia estética de percibir sensorialmente una obra puede ser tan fuerte como el concepto que la soporta detrás. De esta manera, digamos que él quiere él quiere llegar a combinar estas dos ideas, no que una suprima a la otra, sino que las dos juntas, digamos, se complementen para que tanto la idea como la experiencia valgan la pena. Eso. Creo que Luis tiene una pregunta.
Simon, I have a question. What's the importance the humor in your music?
Yeah. So only recently I would even start to speak about humor in my music, because even if it was there, it was never there as something for its own sake. And I think for me, I'm never composing with humor. I think it's just something that comes naturally. I think, first of all, by working with a very informal material, a material which is not serious or sad, or yeah. So it's kind of a light material. Sometimes doesn't mean that it's light in the end, but it's at least it's kind of informal. And then secondly, I'm working a lot with logics, establishing logics, and then breaking them, or establishing an expectation and then taking that expectation in another way. And that is something we know a lot from music, but it's also the same recipe as if you make a good joke. And so I think there's kind of this border area where a good surprise seems funny. You might not be laughing, but it's kind of the same area. It's this kind of surprise. And I think that's, from these two ways, I arrive at something which might be that might have humor in it, but I don't start by thinking, how can I make this humorous? Sometimes I don't think about it at all. I just kind of go with what I would like to hear and what I think could be interesting and funny, but not funny in the haha way, but funny in the way where you kind of, you have some endorphins released in your brain. It's a satisfactory moment of something surprising, or you see the backside or a different perspective of something you didn't expect, something like that.
En consideración de la pregunta de Luis, que básicamente le preguntó cómo él lidia con el humor y cómo él, digamos, qué concepto tiene del humor en su música y qué rol juega en su música. Para él llega a resultados humorísticos por procesos muy naturales. No es que él piense en el humor como decir, bueno, ahora quiero generar humor, quiero generar una risa, sino que el humor es básicamente es un resultado natural de ciertas lógicas y maneras que él tiene de trabajar, o elementos con los que trabaja. Él trabaja mucho con lógicas establecidas o expectativas que uno tiene, si pasa esto, luego pasa esto, y rompiendo muchas veces con esos procesos, generando la sorpresa, es como él llega, digamos, a estos resultados humorísticos, que no son de alguna manera esto de algo gracioso, de que produzca risa, sino que es más bien algo que termina siendo algo simpático y algo, vamos a decir, que produce placer, que produce, digamos, segrega endorfinas en el cuerpo, pero no es esto de morirse de una carcajada de risa en el piso. Eso es como él, y a veces no lo piensa incluso conscientemente, querer hacer humor. Termina siendo el resultado de este proceso de romper con lógicas establecidas y con ciertas expectativas, y como resultado aparece la sorpresa y luego el humor. Gonzalo tiene una pregunta.
I'd like to...
Yeah.
¿Se me escucha?
Sí.
Yes.
I'd like to ask, how do you organize these large forms? Which are if there are some criteria about, I don't know, tempo, proportions, density of sound materials, density of relations, and what is the relationship between these large forms and the diverse materials do you use?
Yeah, I understand. And yeah, the large forms, I think they're really, really interesting and also difficult, but also they can be also very generous. And now we talked about silence and action in the beginning. And something that I learned and I really appreciate in a large form is the beginning, that where you can make something where almost nothing happens, and you can stretch it quite long, and it's still not too long, and in a way it kind of signals the arc of the long form. So in fact, I'm using the long form to have these moments of much less intensity, no? And I think a big part of my way of dealing with a large scale form is actually something that I learned from, and that we all kind of know from film. And at a certain point, I started working much more, leaving all the ideas about polyphony. And I started working very, let's say, homophonically, in the sense that I tried, a little bit like in a film, to have always one situation. But then I would have different scenes or different situations and different materials, and I always take very much care to keep them very clear. So you can't confuse this one with this one. It's also something you know from film. The moment you don't recognize two locations from each other or two characters from each other, it doesn't work. So I'm very careful in the disposition, even from the beginning, to make things very different in many different ways in order to always have a strong identity. And then I work with cuts, and I have this feeling. And in the beginning it was just an idea. Now it's almost like I can't imagine doing anything else. And the wonderful thing is I have this feeling that through the cuts you can obtain a different kind of polyphony. Just like when you watch a movie and you move to a different scene, you can actually have this feeling that both scenes are taking place at the same time, especially when we return to the first scene. It seems like, if done in the right way, our mind actually still perceives it linearly, retrospectively. And I think it's the sort of same phenomena on a big scale as what we in English call pseudo-polyphony, as we know it in a Bach violin partita, where you only have single notes. Is actually not a polyphonic piece, but in our minds, the different registers connect. So we have the bass line, and we have some kind of middle harmony, and we have the melody line, but it's really dots, and they're never happening at the same time. The same thing I work with on a large scale. And then something which is maybe not so cinematic is I try to often make it dynamic, meaning these cuts are not just happening at random times. I try to have a direction in the cuts. So often you'll see certain cuts coming more and more often, or less and less often, or they get longer and longer, or shorter and shorter. So you have sort of a feeling of a direction going somewhere. And then I really think of it as a dramaturgy, it could be a film, it could be a show. I'm thinking this is yeah, this is a whole evening. People, they come in, I give them a little bit, I keep them entertained, I would almost say. And I try to stretch the material as much as I can, but I try to put in expansions of the material, or twists of the material, or surprises, if you will, at the right times when you need them to keep things going. So just like in a good symphony or in a good movie, I also think of my climax and the way to get there, and my surprise, etc. I really think about time as something to always point forward, which yeah, some of these terms that I'm using are terms that, at least in the German avant-garde, has been kind of abandoned, like this directionality and this kind of dramaturgical climax. But I think for me, I think my reference point is really a movie, which of course a movie doesn't have to be light or easy or non-complex. It can easily be all those things. It can be super complex. It can also be too much. So these are not ways to make things simple, but I think it's a good reference model for the kind of complexity that I want, that comes more in the cuts and in the twists and in the perspectives than in the traditional polyphonic or in traditional complexity. I only partly answered your question, and I also partly answered something that you didn't ask, but I think maybe it's okay. Maybe it makes sense.
Yes, thank you.
And Alejandro, I don't know if
it's kind of complex, but actually his question was about how Simon, perdón, lo tengo que decir en español. La pregunta fue básicamente cómo Simon trabaja las formas largas, las formas grandes de las obras de muchísima duración. Básicamente, él encuentra que las formas largas son difíciles, a su vez son interesantes, pero a la vez también le dan a él muchas posibilidades. Es muy generosas. Él puede desarrollar mucho y explayarse muy bien. Él básicamente lo que hace, su primera técnica es concentrarse mucho en el principio, y desarrolla el comienzo de la obra muy lentamente, pero y para generar una gran intensidad. Básicamente, lo más importante para decir de cómo él trabaja con las formas largas, él lo relaciona mucho con el cine, es decir, él lo aprendió del cine, o su approach, por así decir, él lo toma de ahí. Es decir, hay hay una situación, es decir, se describe algo, por así decir, hay una historia, hay un hilo conductor, y él trata de que los diferentes materiales sean muy, muy claros, y luego trata de que la disposición y el transcurso de cómo se desarrollan también sean claros. Y una cosa para él muy importante son los cuts, es decir, los cortes, los cambios de escena, como los conocemos en el cine, que una y otra vez pueden volver a recapitular algo que ya pasó y volver o seguir desarrollando y de cierta manera volver a ordenar la historia, por así decir, o el hilo conductor de diferentes maneras. Y otra cosa que él toma mucho o en la que él se concentra es en la dramaturgia. Digamos, él trata de que todo lo que se va desarrollando sea, digamos, como o sea, él piensa esto de las formas largas también como un show, trata de entretener, trata de que sea como una película, pero a su vez puede ser, no necesariamente tiene que ser complejo, no necesariamente profundo, o a la vez sí. Es decir, es un poco dinámico todo, pero para resumirlo a grandes rasgos, él básicamente hace un paralelismo con el cine, cuando desarrolla formas extremadamente largas.
Yeah. Any more questions? I'll try to make it shorter, my answer. I forgot myself. I just went off.
It's good. I can
And
resume
yeah.
briefly.
Okay.
Gonzalo creo que tenía otra pregunta.
Yes. Another question, non-related to the last one. Do you work around repetition a lot? And
Mhm.
how
And
do you
okay.
how do you conceive it, and how do you escape repetition?
Mhm. I would say I work a lot with repetition, but and of course sometimes in the form of a loop, which is the traditional musical repetition, but actually more often in the form of a ritual. So that's something that keeps coming back, but not necessarily as a loop, but it's like, and that is actually a little bit what I referred to before as establishing a logic, because, or if you think of it as a ritual, every now and then a certain thing happens in a certain way, right? And after a while, you're getting used to, it's almost like a ritornello. Okay, now this is happening again. And it establishes a sort of ritual or logic that this thing happens in this particular way. And one of the reasons I do this is actually to then later, you say, how do you escape it? Well, I think I repeat it so many times that the moment it comes and you think, oh, that's that, then I do something else. So let's say it's something where always two things are happening at the same time. Then if the 10th time it comes back, and then only one happens, or it happens first the one, then the other, or something else. These are just random examples. And I think that is one of the ways that I use repetition the most. Things that come back, but when they come back, at one point it changes, or things that come back, but when it comes back, it's slightly different. Yeah. So I think that's what can take any object and make it a motif when it comes back. Like Celibidache, he all the time he says shh, and then it stops. No? And then the next time the choir says shh, and then he says shh. And then it's kind of a building up this ritual, and it's kind of a repetition. But then in the end, it becomes almost like a noise melody. And it kind of goes somewhere else. So all these, it becomes a motive because of the repetition. And then, of course, there are the loops, which I seldomly do mechanically. So what I often like to do is loops that change the length, a little bit like the walking and walk the walk, where I kind of scale it in and scale it out. But now Alejandro is getting a lot to translate again. Or something I do quite a lot in a way, what I said before, that I keep coming back to something in these cuts. In a way that sometimes almost also seems like a repetition. So for example, the thing with the whip pan, that comes 10 times before, but it's just like first time it just comes, the next time it comes again, a little bit longer. So that becomes a ritual, and then in the end, it gets its moment, the moment that you saw. Or I take something, and the next time it comes back, I twist the perspective on it. Yeah. So again, only a 3/4 answer, but I think, but then I answered something else as well. So maybe in total, it's a full answer.
La pregunta de Gonzalo fue respecto de cómo trabaja él con las repeticiones y a su vez también cómo escapa él de las mismas repeticiones. Simon trabaja mucho con la idea del loop y con la idea y también la idea de llegar mediante repeticiones a generar como una especie de ritual. Es decir, hay una lógica dentro de sus repeticiones y lo que él trata es demostrar, ok, hay algo que está pasando en un momento particular, en un lugar, hay un proceso donde hay algo que se repite, pero lo que él trata de hacer también para romper otra vez con esto de la lógica de lo esperado, como él comentaba antes, es hacer una repetición, pero modificando algo dentro de ella, modificando su longitud, modificando alguna característica de este motivo, digamos. Otra forma otro ejemplo es, por ejemplo, de esto en Walk to Walk, con esto de las cámaras y esto del whip, esto de cambiar el foco, o la acción de caminar con las cortinas que también nos mostró. Son acciones que se vuelven a repetir, que vuelven a llevarnos a recapitular alguna idea que ya hemos conocido en la pieza, pero mediante las repeticiones o rompiendo con la lógica de lo que uno cree que va a pasar, modificando sus características, quizás es como él logra de alguna manera, dentro de la repetición, escapar de la misma.
Anybody else? I think we have a question from Leandra.
Is the question in the chat?
No.
Ah.
Me desmuteé. Te la hago en castellano. Ya que hablaste tanto de tu interés por el cine, me interesaría saber si tenés referentes, como que nombraste a Wes Anderson, y si hay algún otro director que te interesa particularmente en el cine.
Mm-hmm. So right now, I think one of my big, actually, I would say I don't have many, let's say, inspirations, but one is David Lynch. And I just keep rediscovering it. And I think there's something that I love in his way of working, which is this way of working with the cliche, but it gets a different meaning, and it's almost everything looks very simple, or there is a certain logic, but then it gets a twist, and it has this mix of something, yeah, sort of documentary, but it also has this element of fantastic. But it's, I would say, not so much in the aesthetics and in all these techniques. So Wes Anderson and Edgar Wright, I love these two, but it's more for the action. It's more like on a technical level, I think. So I would say the only person I could really point to would be David Lynch, which is such a simple, boring answer, but that's the truth. And I can only say that my favorite scene ever in a movie is the Mulholland Drive club scene with the Nwai Banda. And it's so simple, but it's just so great. And when I rewatched Twin Peaks when the third season came out, and I just realized that it's still very modern in this way of dealing with, actually also with humor, and making something which is both caricature and spooky. And it's such a weird, there's a lot of alienation, estrangement. There's a lot of Bertolt Brecht in a way, just in a whole different way. This way that you experience something, but it's something else than it seems. Mm-hmm. And I can add one last thing for my new project, because I am also a very big fan of science fiction. And so I came up with this excuse for myself that I needed to rewatch all my favorite science fiction movies for the tuba piece. And so I watched a lot of science fiction. And finally I get to make my own science fiction movie. And of course it's very abstract and very different, but I think it's kind of a boyish dream come true. Like since I was a little boy, I wanted to make a sci-fi movie.
Bueno, respecto a la pregunta con el cine, donde habló de los directores que le apasionan, David Lynch, por ejemplo, es uno de los más referenciales para él. Lo más relevante es, él es un gran fanático de la ciencia ficción y por lo que dijo, su nuevo proyecto está muy relacionado con esto. Él siempre quiso hacer una película de ciencia ficción y aparentemente va a poder cumplir su sueño por medio de este nuevo proyecto. Is this like this?
Yeah, more or less.
Okay.
I didn't understand the last part, but let's just assume that it's
You're gonna make your dream true of being director of a science fiction.
Exactly.
Through your new project.
Through my new project. It's a dream come true.
I don't know what it's about.
No. Well, I don't know what it's about either, but you know, it's like coming together, and it's still, I also still want it to be based on a musical logic. But it's it has references to, for example, The Room that I told you about. It's a very strong reference to 2001, where in the end, after the transcendental LSD trip, he ends in this old Renaissance room, etc. So there are all these references also built in.
Su proyecto todavía no tiene forma definida, es decir, no sabe bien sobre qué va a ser, pero va a tener una lógica musical y dentro del concepto va a poder volcar su pasión por la ciencia ficción.
And tons of references to the history of science fiction movies. Yeah.
Y va a poder también dar a luz o mostrar muchas de las influencias o referencias del cine que a él más le interesan.
Cool.
¿Más preguntas del público?
If not, I want to say thanks for listening and staying with us. It's great. And yeah, I'd rather come visit you in Buenos Aires, but that's not possible now. But I will be looking forward to whenever I again get an excuse to go to Buenos Aires, or the other way around, see you somewhere in Europe.
Thank you, Simon, very much for your time and for sharing your experiences and your work with us. I think it has been a great time. It was really fun to talk to you and also listening to the other questions of the other people. So thank you very much. I think everybody is really grateful.
That's amazing to hear. Let me share this link with you that I promised.
Yeah,
it's there. In case you didn't see it, it's 37 minutes. It's inside the Festspielhaus in Bayreuth, and it's sort of a staging of The Ring of the Nibelung, but of course very fragmented and in the form of a runtime era, which is this ongoing project, site-specific project that I do, but also with a lot of Wagner. So it's really stagings of Wagner, but always with a big twist. So that's another big interest of mine, taking existing works, which is also sort of found objects, no? And twist the perspective, also in the sense of a staging. Cool.
Thank you very much, Simon.
Thank you very much, Simon.
Thank you.
Okay, did everybody get the link, or was it just ID? Because everyone.
No, we didn't receive it.
You didn't receive it. Okay, let me see if I can do this. Everyone. Ah, I found out how to do it. Everyone in meeting, and here it is. Sorry. There it is. Thank you, Aide.
Thanks.
You got it?
Great.
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay.
Okay, Simon, thank you very much.
See you around.
Thank you.
Ciao.
We will send
We'll
Bye.
chat. We'll chat later. Ciao.
Bye bye.
un tag. Bueno, Ale, impresionante tu traducción y tu anfitrionismo. Muy bien.
Muchas
Excelente.
gracias. Fue un trabajo
Sí, sí, sí.
exhausto, pero la verdad que fue muy divertido. Además, Simón es un tipo interesantísimo y las cosas que nos ha compartido creo que son de un gran valor y de una gran inspiración para todos.
Sí, sí, una gran
Sí,
inspiración.
maravilloso. Sí, mucha concentración de tu parte, la verdad que admirable.
Sí, creo que debo haber escrito unas 25